Welcome to this lecture that combines discussion of Game of Thrones Episode 5, The Wolf and the Lion, with the second part of Machiavelli's reading from Chapter 12 to the end that you did for this week. I've woven together those two texts to bring you Prince Renly, a case study. This week, your houses are preparing arguments advocating your assigned character's subscription to Machiavelli's philosophical codes that he lays out in The Prince. And so to that end, I thought I'd do something different, focus on a single scene from Game of Thrones. In this case, it's between Renly Baratheon and Loras Tyrell. I did this because Renly was not assigned to any of our houses, and I also thought that I'd weave together a discussion of this bit of reading with the Game of Thrones episode, as I did find this particular scene was one of many in the series that pulled back to offer some meta commentary on the political world, and given that you guys are going to have to apply the Prince the entire work to description of your character's fitness to assume the role described in the text, I thought I'd do a little bit of practical application like that.
Lord Stark's lucky he still has a head.
Robert will rant for a few days, but he won't do anything. He adores the man.
You're jealous.
You sure this won't hurt?
Only if I slip.
You prefer me like this?
Mm-hmm.
If you want hairless, maybe you should find a little boy.
I want you.
So in this scene, we get some insight into Renly and Loras's romantic relationship, and largely what they talk about is the political landscape of Game of Thrones. So I want to think about, at least in this segment, how their romantic relationship reflects on the political landscape. First and foremost, political relationships largely throughout the Middle Ages, and to a great extent in Game of Thrones, are relationships between men, and so this becomes even more prevalent when we study Beowulf. I will definitely jam on this fact very, very decisively. So in Game of Thrones, even marriages such as Robert's with Cersei are meant to facilitate political alliances and are more about the partnerships between the men than the heteronormative romantic relationship per se. Renly, Loras has teased Renly a bit about being jealous that his brother favors Ned Stark. Robert and Ned, say what you will, like they do have a very strong friendship that, of course, becomes strained throughout the course of this season. And Cersei observes the same thing. That she says later in this episode, she's sorry that his marriage to Ned didn't work out. And of course, later in that conversation, they kid around, what holds the reign together. And, Cersei says our marriage, and they have a good laugh and, wonder how it's been able to hang in together for 17 years. And so that's a whole other complicated conversation. But isn't it interesting that their heteronormative marriage is a political arrangement? They really hate each other's guts. And in fact, Robert is in love with Ned's sister. And so I'm not implying anything about Robert's affections for Ned per se, but I'm saying that, romantic relationships and political relationships are A, deeply intertwined, and B, usually the relationships between men are privileged in some way. And so this is brought to the surface in the homosexual relationship between Renly and Loras. And I really like their relationship a lot. It seems very genuine and playful in a world full of schemers and fake people. I'm just going to point out the people in this picture. Let me get some ink on my pen. So this is King Richard II of England, who rules in the late 14th century. This is his 7-year-old queen, Isabella of Valois, and her dad, King Charles VI of France. So yeah, obviously a middle-aged man isn't marrying a little girl, to have a mature adult relationship with her. It really is symbolic, as we see in this picture, that she is a bridge between the relationship between the two men. You'll notice in The Prince that there is little or no mention of making marriages. So there's discussion of inheriting a princedom. There's discussion of making allies and different sorts of quote unquote marriages with other people and cultures, but no such thing as like, just marry. Well, if you want to acquire a princedom, if there's such a mention, if you blink, you miss it. Because I looked back through the text and was really stunned that there isn't discussion of, hey, get yourself a woman who's well positioned and marry her. That is not even on the table. And I think that would be a way to angle yourself into a position of power. If your house has to account for some kind of political power accrued through marriage, I think that you can extrapolate from other things that Machiavelli says, and that goes for other situations that he doesn't expressly speak to. Think about what he does say and make a very educated guess. So you have to work a little bit harder, but you know that your queen will reward your hard work and creativity very generously.
You should find a little boy.
I want you.
My brother thinks that anyone who hasn't been to war isn't a man. He treats me as if I'm a spoiled child. Oh, and you're not? Loras Tyrell, the Knight of the Flowers? How many wars have you fought in? Oh, and how much did your father spend on that armor of yours?
Hold still.
All I ever hear from Robert and Stannis is how I'm not tough enough, how I squirm at the sight of blood.
You did vomit when that boy's eye was knocked out in the melee.
His eye was dangling out of the damn socket.
He shouldn't have entered the melee if he didn't know how to fight.
Easy for you to say. Not everyone is such a gifted swordsman.
Oh, it's not a gift. No one gave it to me. I'm good because I work at it. Every day of my life since I could hold a stick.
I could work at fighting all day, every day. I'd still never be as good as you.
Yes, well, I guess we'll never know.
So in this scene, Loras Tyrell has not yet told Renly. He hasn't popped the question, so to speak, and said, you know who'd make a good king? You. And they haven't yet gotten into that conversation. But they are talking about some of those components more relevant, I think, here to notions of masculinity within the context of the show. So I'm going to put a pin in those for now, because I'm really trying to look at this scene relevant to the prince. And they're also touching on the degree to which a king should be a warrior. And of course, Renly's brother Robert is a warrior and maybe not so great of a king, and is he even really so great of a warrior? So earlier in this episode, we've seen that he's had to cram himself into his breastplates. He prefers just to watch tournaments. He likes to go hunting, so he's kind of circling the drain of going to war, but is he still really a warrior, or is that now a remote fantasy? And then, of course, Loras has won the tournament earlier in the episode, and so here's Renly, who two of the closest men in his life are quote unquote like more warrior like than he. So yeah, what does Machiavelli say about war? So he says a lot in The Prince. So for example, in chapter 14, he says war is the sole art looked for in one who rules, and he talks a lot about war, and so you will want to study just beyond that little fortune cookie dictum, ways to manage your armies and ways to manage your allies, and when to use some controlled violence on your enemies and conspirators. But to what extent does the prince's preoccupation with war entail his directly being a warrior? And I think that this is up to interpretation. So in this very chapter, Machiavelli discusses acquiring knowledge via practice or via study. And so it seems like, yeah, you could use some measure of both is what I got out of that chapter. And I don't know whether anywhere in the book it speaks of the prince himself actually getting his hands bloody, like it's, metaphorically getting his hands bloody, that he's given a command to have somebody killed or start a war. But the degree to which that implies that you'd have to actually just stomach watching somebody's eyeball hanging out of his socket, I don't know how much of a blood and guts warrior you have to be. And so this is for you guys to think about as you put together your arguments. So yeah, as I said, Machiavelli describes how the prince should be armed. But as you read, you think about to what degree he means actually personally, physically armed, a blood and guts kind of, more of an Anglo-Saxon kind of king, warming y'all up for Beowulf, which we'll do after spring break. Because, yeah, some of you will have to make creative arguments in that your candidates aren't blood and guts kinds of people in the context of the show.
So, how did it end up? The Targaryen girl will die?
Needs to be done, unpleasant as it is. Robert's rather tasteless about it. Every time he talks about killing her, I swear the table rises 6 inches.
It's a shame he can't muster the same enthusiasm for his wife.
He does have a deep, abiding lust for her money. You have to give it to the Lannisters. They may be the most pompous, ponderous cunts the gods ever suffered to walk the world, but they do have an outrageous amount of money.
I have an outrageous amount of money.
Not as much as the Lannisters.
But a lot more than you.
Robert's threatening to take me hunting with him. Last time we were out there for 2 weeks, tramping through the trees in the rain, day after day, all so he can stick his spear into something's flesh. But Robert loves his killing, and he's the king.
How did that ever happen?
Because he loves his killing, and he used to be good at it.
Yeah, so a really interesting scene that explores masculinity on the show, but I don't think that's mutually exclusive with my talking about the scene vis-a-vis the prince and Renly's fitness for that role, as well as his being quote-unquote King Renly in the context of the show. So if you want to find out if he becomes King Renly, you'll have to watch beyond the end of season 1. Dun, dun, dun. In this scene, though, he complains that he doesn't want to go hunting, which we're supposed to think here in this scene, yeah, what kind of warrior would he make, and thus, like, what kind of king would he make, because there's other evidence that he's squeamish. And in some very heavy-handed symbolism, he says that he doesn't want to have to go hunting with Robert, because that is just a matter of Robert sticking his spear into something's flesh. At this very moment, Renly has a razor sticking into his flesh in a bit of subtle symbolism. So he's really more the hunted, and Loras is more the quote-unquote hunter, albeit just playfully right now with a razor. And yeah, the tournament is like, fantasy football compared to real football. So I know it looks really violent and people die there on the show, but in the Middle Ages it would have been kind of more just like probably like touch football is a better way of putting it than fantasy football. Think though, like, yes, he doesn't like hunting. Yes, he got grossed out by the tournament, but when it comes to what has to be done regarding Daenerys Targaryen, Renly says it has to be done. He draws a really fine line, condemning Robert's enjoyment of it. So a couple of lessons from this little brace of issues that I've raised on this slide. Nobody is really going to fit the prince mold perfectly. And I think that if you do look at the prince mold, On the other hand, it really is very finely tuned. So like the prince isn't the caricature of just unmitigated violence that has seeped into popular culture. So yeah, I'd say that Renly's being grossed out by uh, hunting animals and the guy's eye hanging out of its socket like doesn't really exclude him from fitting the warrior king model, because he does have the guts to say the pregnant Daenerys Targaryen's got to go. What would Machiavelli himself say about Ned's wait and see attitude about Daenerys Targaryen? I mean, he does offer a lot of really good arguments for chillaxing. You don't know that the rumor is true. Jorah Mormont has been exiled from Westeros, and yeah, the child is just an infant. Once it's born, are you really gonna be afraid of little Daenerys Targaryen and an infant? So what would Machiavelli say? He would not like the wait and see attitude that Ned Stark takes regarding Daenerys. It always spells disaster for the prince. So he is not a fan of fortune. I know that word has ambiguous meaning for a present day audience, but for Machiavelli, it really is like the X factor in life. So like a roll of the dice. It's more like chance than like I inherited a fortune or I've had good fortune. For example, in that he doesn't like to leave things to chance and have a wait and see attitude. So this is a little bit of a tangent from that point, but he says once somebody's made a prince by the nobles, he has a tougher time than one made by the people, and that's because the nobles then are bubbling with their own ambitions. You aren't really absolutely in power. Then the nobles are expecting something in return, and they have their own eye on the prize, so to speak. So you do have more absolute power over the people, which is why they're less threatening. Additionally, if you see a rebellion brewing, quash it immediately. So nothing is ever gained by waiting and seeing, other than regret. And as he puts it, time driving all things before it may bring with it evil as well as good. And so this sentiment that he expresses early on in The Prince is then repeated in his later discourse about Lady Fortune toward the end of the book. So throughout the second part of The Prince, pay attention to his discussions of murder, violence, and war. So while Renly is not quite the warrior king that Machiavelli imagines, he does have the right attitude toward necessary evils. So he doesn't like that Robert seems to actually get real personal satisfaction out of wanting to kill a pregnant woman. He's more thinking, yeah, better one pregnant lady than hundreds of thousands of our people. So this is the numbers that he's crunched in his brain, and so it's a real Sophie's Choice kind of dilemma that he's we're supposed to imagine that he's walked through in his mind. What exactly constitutes Machiavelli's attitude toward controlled violence? So it is that you deliver it very swiftly, you deliver it very decisively, and that you don't really enjoy the bloodlust for its own sake. So looking at Machiavelli's claim that war is not to be avoided, then taking apart the prince bit by bit, I don't think that the person that he describes is supposed to be a warmonger per se. So as you develop your portrait of the prince and think about how your character fits that mold, you'll want to figure out all of those shades of gray regarding when controlled violence should be used and when war should be made.
Do you know who should be king?
Be serious.
I am. My father could be your bank. I've never fought in a war before, but I'd fight for you.
I'm fourth in line.
And where's Robert in the line of royal succession? Joffrey is a monster. Tommen is 8.
Stannis?
Stannis has the personality of a lobster.
He's still my older brother. What are you doing?
Look at it.
You cut me.
It's just blood. We've all got it in us. Sometimes a little spills. If you become king, you're going to see a lot of this. You need to get used to it.
So in this segment, Loras says exactly what's on his mind. You know who should be king? You, Renly. Yeah, a really interesting proposition in context of the entire show, and something that I'm going to home in on more when we study Mallory's Morte Arthur, that Renly does have a hereditary claim, yet we know that there would have to be a bit of war, as implied in Loras's shedding of Renly's own blood there. And, you know, like, you kind of have to have the guts and pony up the intestinal fortitude to be able to make this happen. So this isn't exactly what Machiavelli is talking about with a mixed princedom. What he imagines there in the earlier segment of the book is that some of it's inherited and you just add on segments to it that are acquired via conquest. But indeed, like, Renly does join together these two different paths to the throne through lineage and through conquest. So, like, really, like, the key ways that power and lands are acquired. So yeah, Loras says that he would serve as Renly's warrior, and note that Machiavelli, like, goes through a drill down that is more particular than any of us might imagine one could be about different types of warriors that a prince should seek out. So mercenaries come with their own set of problems, that they're just doing it, you know, for the money. Auxiliaries, yeah, actually work for yes, your allies, but they might have divided loyalties. And then also a national, quote unquote, what we'd call a national army. So even though we're not talking about different countries here within Westeros, yeah, Loras would be a member of Renly's national army, his, you know, personal force. And additionally, this is why Loras is a nice fit for secretary. So, of course, what Machiavelli means is not somebody who answers the phone and takes memos and does a lot of typing. So this is more like the hand of the king in the Game of Thrones world. And, you know, from the word secretary, or should I say in the word secretary, we see the word secret. And so indeed it is a very important job, and anybody who's worked in an office knows that the secretary has his or her finger on the pulse of the entire operation, even though they don't get compensated in the way that they deserve. But even though these two guys are romantically involved, and I should say, you know, because they're romantically involved, he's a good secretary because he's, you know, keeping secrets and sharing secrets with Renly's. It doesn't really seem at this point that he's trying to advance a personal agenda. Like, he wants to go to war for Renly and advance Renly's cause. So this changes a bit in Loras's picture. Loras's sister comes into the picture in subsequent seasons, and she has this, she changes things up quite a bit. So she's not all that relevant to season 1. As I've suggested, what Machiavelli argues about the prince's actual temperament, like, really is a carefully, calculatingly constructed balance between different temperaments. So, like, one of the few absolutes is don't rely on fortune, but that is to say, to unpack what Loras has been telling him, like, I don't know that you really necessarily have to be somebody who's a blood and guts kind of king. And that is to say, you guys can argue creatively for your individual characters. I mean, you just have to be willing to make war and, you know, quote unquote, do what needs to be done, such as give the command that a pregnant lady has to be killed. So arguably you could just know about war. So, I mean, going back to what Tyrion says in a much earlier episode, his brother Jaime has his sword, and Tyrion has his books, and a mine needs books like a sword needs a whetstone. So, would somebody like Tyrion be disqualified from being quote unquote a prince just because he's not as physically robust as some of the other characters? So notice in chapter 19, Machiavelli has a discussion of the prince's need to have both human and animal natures. And then within the animal natures, you need to balance between the lion and the fox. So the lion, more of a brute force to scare away the wolves, and the fox, crafty and cunning. So as you read the second part of the book, like, unhinge yourself from preconceived ideas that the Machiavellian prince is just completely evil and after bloodlust, etc. I mean, it's really it's almost creepy the way the picture of his character is described as being so calculatingly contrived. Here's an example of this balanced picture. He says it's better to be feared than loved, but try not to be so fearful that you're hated. So you're really towing like a very thin line in crafting your princely persona. And as I've said before, not when it comes to matters that rely on fortune and thus time, because leaving something to chance is not a good idea. So as far as like the prince's personality, I would say that it really is more pliable and plastic than the average popular reader might imagine, with this one thing that really sticks out to me as an absolute bottom line no. Don't leave things to fortune. If they present themselves, you need to act even rashly, is what he says, because fortune herself is kind of rash and fickle, so you're just kind of gonna beat her at her own game. So says Machiavelli.
People love you. They love to serve you because you're kind to them. They want to be near you. You're willing to do what needs to be done. But you don't gloat over it. You don't love killing. Where is it written that power is the sole province of the worst? That thrones are only made for the hated and the feared? You would be a wonderful king.
So as Loras says to Renly in this scene, people love to serve you because you are kind to them. So, does that seem antithetical to what Machiavelli argues in The Prince? So on the one hand, to unpack this in some level of detail, yes, you should really worry more about what the populace, the average people, think of you over the nobles, because the nobles are, have some kind of axe to grind, and they've got some skin in the game, so to speak, and they are politically ambitious themselves. And so if you have to suck up to one group of people, the populace would be the group over the nobles. And think about what Machiavelli says about the people, like, throughout his text. So when some kind of violence is being exacted, it usually is between politicians and leaders and their armies. Like, he doesn't talk about genocide just for the fun of it. So that's not to say that he, as I put it here, he's not a Mr. Rogers, but you're kind of indifferent toward the people, and you are more invested in keeping up appearances. So as he says in chapter 18, thus it is well to seem merciful, faithful, humane, religious, and upright, and also to be so. So that's kind of surprising. He does talk about with some things like being generous. Yeah, you just seem that way and you aren't really that way. You just do enough to put in a show. But here he says, yeah, you really should be all of those things. but you have to have the capacity, as he goes on. The mind should also remain so balanced that were it needful not to be so, you should be able to know how to change to the contrary. So it's the ability to drop not only the seeming, but also the being, all of those good, wonderful characteristics. So as you can see, what I'm suggesting is, he wants the prince to toe like a very fine, calculated line, and then here with the mention of changeability, that you just roll with fortune. It's the ability to adapt, that fortune is a cruel mistress, and if you need to be a jerk, you've got to go ahead and do that. Liberality and miserliness, so generosity and stinginess is what Machiavelli is talking about. As I suggested on the earlier slide regarding generosity toward the populace, you just want the appearance of being generous. So this is one of the quote unquote positive character traits that he says, you need to fake this and just get a reputation for being quote unquote liberal, but not actually be that way. And when you think about it, he's really, really insightful. So it isn't just be the biggest Grinch that you can possibly imagine because you're the prince, and you have to just be skin stretched over Satan, because we know that the character is much more calculatingly contrived. He says, there is no quality so self-destructive as liberality, for while you practice it, you lose the means whereby it can be practiced. So once again, like with this character trait being an example, that you have to calculate every single move that you make while you're the prince, and in this case, craft a public reputation for generosity that actually is not all that true. So getting back to what I called the get her done attitude that Machiavelli says the prince needs to adopt, there too, here's what Loras says to Renly: you're willing to do what needs to be done. So I'd say that's the virtue, that you put your foot on the gas, you've got the motivation, you've got the chutzpah, you can you're summing up the grit when you need to, but then there's a bit of moderation, the calculation. You don't gloat over it. You don't love killing. So again, the prince doesn't necessarily need to be a bloodthirsty war monster. So as I say there, Loras is saying that Renly has virtue, that you can get the job done. Earlier in this episode, if we think about Loras's own path to success, he's won the tournament against the Mountain, and of course the Mountain and the Hound have reputations for being the biggest bullies on the block. He's craftily ridden a mare that's in heat, and so that detail might have gotten lost on those of us who are city folks who've never ridden a horse. This gets the opponent's stallion, as I say, hot and bothered. So Loras had the get her done attitude. Like I'd say in this case, it's more applicable that he's ridden the wheel of Fortuna, so to speak. So the tournament itself is a game. Why leave anything to chance when, as Cersei will famously say in a later episode, I believe it's 7, when you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. So he's not going to get a participation trophy for being in the tournament. He needs to win the Mountain, and so he'll do so by any means possible. So also a good example here of the ends justifying the means. So I think that we will see an example of this in an upcoming episode regarding Tyrion and his situation there with Cat Stark's sister at the Eyrie. So final slide here. Logic cuts deeper than swords. Here is a comment that Loris makes that suggests to me, even though they're talking about warfare by and large in this scene, it seems like this character has a bit of political acumen. That he's the fox as well as like the lion or some other more threatening kind of animal. Loris says to Renly, "Where is it written that power is the sole province of the worst? Thrones are only made for the hated and the feared." So that should ring a bell from the bit of Machiavelli that you read this week. So on the one hand, he sounds a bit naive, and the people, quote unquote, loving Renly, and that they support him because he's kind to them. I might want to explore that like a little bit more, and I don't know like quite what he's referring to based on what we've seen of Renly thus far. But it is a common misconception that Machiavelli advocates somebody just being the most raging jerk possible. Like you're actually a pretty temperate personality in many ways. I mean, granted, one I don't think I could stomach adopting, but still, like the prince is not as big of a monster as one might think. Just a small monster. Machiavelli, albeit in the translation that is available in English, ponders this idea. So you'll want to think about this as you do your character analysis. How does he come down on the relationship between being loved, as Loris says Renly is, being feared and being hated, where I'm sure that plenty of the other characters whom you are examining for your house project in the coming week fit into those latter two categories pretty readily. So good luck and Godspeed.